Today, we are thrilled to welcome Daniel Kraus talking about his new book, Wrath, in conversation with Grady Hendrix. Wrath's co-author, Shäron Moalem, will unfortunately not be able to join us this evening. Daniel Kraus is a New York Times bestselling author. His recent collaboration with legendary filmmaker George A. Romero, The Living Dead, was acclaimed by the New York Times and Washington Post. With Guillermo del Toro, he co-authored Troll Hunters and The Shape of Water, based on the same idea Kraus and del Toro created for the Oscar-winning film. Kraus's The Death and Life of Zebulon Finch was named one of Entertainment Weekly's top 10 books of the year. In a future much nearer than you think, where scientific experimentation is exploited for commercial profit, unwisely under-supervised cutting-edge technology creates a menace that threatens the very fabric of human existence. Wrath by Daniel Kraus and Shäron Moalem is the story of a lab rat instilled with human genes whose supersized intelligence helps him to engineer his escape into the world outside the lab, a world vastly ill-equipped to deal with the menace he represents. Modified through advances that have boosted his awareness of humankind's cruelty in the name of science and endowed with a rat's supernatural proclivity to procreate regularly, Sammy has the potential to sire a rodent army capable of viciously overwhelming the human race. So Kraus will be joined in conversation by Grady Hendrix, a New York Times best-selling horror writer whose books include My Best Friend's Exorcism, Paperbacks from Hell, The Final Girl Support Group, and the upcoming How to Sell a Haunted House, on sale in January. Today's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Also, please support these authors and Powell's by purchasing a copy of this book from us. A link to buy Wrath will be shared in the chat a couple of times during the event. All right, so Daniel and Grady, thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to have you here.
Yeah. And the first thing I was going to say is, Daniel, I am very disappointed that Shäron is not going to be here. I actually wanted to talk to him more than you. So explain what's going on here, because I might log off.
Yeah, you and me both. One of the challenges, but in kind of a good way, of working with someone like Shäron, who is a brilliant geneticist, is that this kind of stuff happens a lot. I can't count how many times we've had phone calls or some sort of situation where he really had to go off and work on saving someone's life or saving the world when it comes to, he's been working on the COVID vaccines throughout the last few years. He really is someone at the cutting edge of science who I feel lucky to have worked with, but sometimes situations pop up like tonight, and he really is in a life and death someone's life and death situation. And I'm left behind to not be able to answer all the science questions, but I'll do my best.
Well, and we'll get to the science. And just before we start, I want to let people know, please, as we go, we are not going to keep the Q&A to the end. Ask questions in the Q&A panel, and I will get to them as they come up as soon as there's a naturally occurring pause. If you put them in the chat box, I'll probably see that, but I'll also know you're very poor at following instructions or very poor at Zoom, one or the other. After all this time, you can't do Zoom. But I want to get to the science in a minute, but I feel like we're burying the lead a little here because this is a killer rat book. Yeah. And we don't get many of those these days.
No.
So what the hell is up with rats and horror? Like, why so many killer rats? I mean, they're just little tiny furry animals that pose no threat.
Yeah, they pose no threat at all, except for various plagues.
That.
And eating of soft matter of anything that's dead or dying. That aside, they're great. Horror and rats have a long storied history together. I mean, you're even go back to early black and white, 20s and 30s. Certainly in the Universal horror era.
Yeah.
And you'll find nary a film without some creepy rats running across a grave or something. Rats are the ultimate survivors. They're sort of rats and cockroaches. Like when we wipe ourselves off the globe, the rats and the cockroaches will just have a wonderful time. And what we've done essentially in our societies create playpens for rats. Like when we're shoved out of the cities, which is a scenario that this book deals with, like our skyscrapers, the way we construct houses, they're just perfect for rats. Like they're what rats would build if they could, build stuff. I mean, when I think of big rat books, there's like Herbert's The Rats, right?
Herbert's The Rats is the big one.
There's, I mean, when you go into movies, there's Willard and Ben.
There's Willard, and I think the first vampire rat, because rats are sort of associated with vampires now. A lot of that's because of the Werner Herzog Nosferatu in the 70s, but they first appeared in the original Nosferatu, coming off the boat. And that was always the thing with rats and the plague, and vampires are always about infection and plague and the sickness. And so I think, rats have really been linked there, but a lot of vermin, and vampires. But yeah, rats, I mean, you've got the famous scene in Salem's Lot, right? When they're looking for the vampire and they fall into this squealing pool of rats. I'm trying to think, James Herbert wrote a sequel to The Rats. Well, you're right, rats is the sheer protagonist, not so much in books.
No. I mean, I've dabbled in rats in a couple books. I had a killer rat scene in Rotters, and I had some good rat action in Zebulon Finch. But yeah, like they're certainly not. They're usually just sort of a disgusting ephemera, and not really the focus of the book, and certainly not a primary character. I've always kind of wanted to do a book where the main character wasn't a human. It was an animal, frankly. It was a dog or something. So this definitely scratched that itch, just that writer's itch of wanting to be from the point of view of an animal.
Yeah. Well, and so how did you decide that now is the time for a rat book, and how the hell did you pitch it? Because my imagination says that pitching a killer rat book, most publishers would recoil with revulsion, like, "Buh," or did they jump all over it?
Well, I mean, the idea didn't come from me. The idea was really Shäron's.
Oh, really? Okay.
And if he was here, he would be able to tell you why. And I'm guessing it has something, and we've talked about it, but it's been years now. I'm guessing it has something to do with all the rats, which he's seen used in labs his entire career. They are, there's a lot of animals there's so much, so many horrible things he's told me about animal use in labs. And we all have some sense of it. When we were kids, we learned that, cosmetics were put into rabbit eyes, and we kind of learned these kind of bad things, but it's generally it's way worse than we think, and it's hidden. It's really hidden because it's a really uncomfortable thing to talk about openly. Is it worth killing this box of rats if grandma may live another 10 years at some point? It's a constant moral struggle for a lot of people anyway. So I'm guessing that's where it grew from for Shäron. When he came to me with the idea, he had most of the plot more or less structured out. He's got a great head for plot beats. So it was really a matter of then doing novelist work of kind of making them all work in a flow and really adding all the characters.
I was going to say, I imagine the characters, that's coming from you.
Yeah, it was more like, here's a CEO of this edited pets company. There should be a scientist who creates it. There's this rat catcher they hire for security. There's a 10-year-old boy who, and we can get into this, who has cochlear implants that allow him to communicate with the rat. So he had the sort of basic needs down.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I'm curious about is, because you have sort of two plot lines running through this. You've got your scientists, and you've got your Dallas and Sammy, the kid with the cochlear implants. And saying, I don't want to spoil anything too much, but kid and a rat. And so why'd you decide that they need to be these two parallel things? Why not just find a sympathetic scientist and stick with them? Are there any sympathetic scientists? Are there
Well,
none?
that was kind of the issue, right? Like we had the scientists really battling with these moral issues that I was talking about, and then the guy who owns the company, Edited Pets, is really not a scientist. He's more the Steve Jobs who has the big idea of we're gonna make genetically edited pets, and gonna turn to the scientists to just go do it, you know?
Yeah.
So really, it was, if the book was going to have any kind of scientific reality, there was really going to be a lot of gray in this science space, because anyone working for this team at Edited Pets was going to have to, because of the intelligence required to be there, was going to have to be kind of aware of the messier and nastier aspects of what they were doing, and you couldn't really have someone who's fully against it, or they wouldn't be in that position. They wouldn't be high enough up the sort of scientific ladder to be a scientist at this place if they were, someone who was absolutely against using animals in testing situations. So also, there's a point where you want to get the rat, the main rat. There's a whole bunch of Sammys in essence, but the prototype rat, at some point you want to get the rat out of the lab. You want the rat to escape. I don't think it's a spoiler to say at some point the rat gets out.
And can I just throw in, folks, in terms of spoilers, minor details may get revealed in this conversation, but you should just assume rats are a threat to a large number of people in this. Like, they don't just sit in cages for the entire book.
That's true.
This is a rat apocalypse book.
This is a rat apocalypse book. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to get the rats out. We wanted to bring in this almost to sort of offset the scientists and the CEO, a purely sympathetic character of this 10-year-old boy who's extremely sympathetic and very likable, who's I think a breath of fresh air after these very murky, morally murky characters that dominate, at least the first third of the book. Once the kid shows up, then you really have a kid and a rat who are, despite everything else happening in the book, are sort of making friends.
Yeah, well, and that's something. So one of the things I want to say is, one of the things that's really amazing when the kid shows up is that he's relating to the rat as another creature, not as laboratory material, not as statistics, not as a research. You know what I mean? He's the first person in the book to be really like actually relating to it as a person or a sentient creature. And it's a huge relief when it comes. And one of the things I was curious about is, you do something that really I wouldn't have the guts to do, which is that early on a rat dies in like the opening moments, and it's a rat that we've developed some affection for and seen do cute things. Was that something that ever gave you pause to put so early in there? Because I know from having killed an animal in a book, a dog, people hate that and they go nuts. But did you feel like, because it's a rat and people don't necessarily identify with rats quite so much as a pet, that you could get away with it?
Well, I think it was kind of necessary. I mean, I guess the way we looked at it. The book begins with what is tantamount to a Apple launch of a new phone. So they're debuting their new pet. They've made a couple other edited pets, but this is their new rat, who's been genetically altered to be super cute and super playful and friendly and highly intelligent, and can communicate through an AAC, so more or less like a touchpad. And you always wonder when you see these big product launches, what if the prototype that they're playing with and showing you goes haywire, goes wrong, and the stocks plunge and it's a disaster. And that's sort of what happens here. And the book is kind of, among other things, it's sort of a cautionary tale about science and biology versus economics. It's kind of akin to something like Theranos, really, where there's a project that's pushed out too quickly, and they haven't got the kinks worked out yet, but there are economic drivers that are pushing the company to work more quickly. And so I think right off the bat, you see this this first rat die, quickly but kind of violently, and that immediately informs you of all of the characters' reactions. We have the CEO who just is furious about it, doesn't care about the rat at all. You have the rat catcher who has spent his life in pest control, but has great respect for rats, and he's much more kind of conflicted and sad about this death. So no, it never felt like a case of getting away with anything, really. It more felt like this was kind of, if we were going to be serious about it, the thing about rats and experiments in labs is they die all the time, you know. And when we start getting edited pets, and we will, this is what's going to happen. They're going to be they're going to go through rats like they go through iPhones.
Well, and this is one of the things that I wanted to wait a little to jump into, but Francis Meredith asked a really, I think, interesting question. So we may as well dive in. She says, are you worried that this book's display of poor ethics in science will encourage people to distrust current science experiments and academic papers? I've got a thought on that, but I think everyone would rather hear yours.
I'm reading the question myself. Well, I mean, there's nothing really to distrust here. Like the conclusions they come to are all logical scientific conclusions. They're doing their tests, they're getting the results, and they're modifying it therein, and everything sort of is quite logical and functional. What the question is more of, is this okay? Is it okay to be mowing through all these rats and monkeys and dogs that use all the time? That's the chilling part, and I think there are a lot of scientists involved in these things who will, or are cognizant of them, who will tell you that this line that, like I said earlier, this line that we're given, that if we burn through these dogs, grandma's going to live another 10 years. It's very rarely is that accurate. Very rarely is that straightforward. And what happens in this book, what it kind of plays out, is the idea that when you're making a product, a customer facing product, it's a loophole in a way. You can get around a lot of these concerns that you wouldn't get for just a pure medical, like Pfizer may have something set up where there's certain regulations they have to follow, et cetera, et cetera. But if Apple starts making edited pets, they won't necessarily have any of those. There's loopholes when it comes to something being recognized as a product. There's a legal loophole right now that testing can be done on pets because pets are property, like you would own a chair. So your dog is more like a chair than it is a living being. So you could test on a pet with much more latitude than you could test on rats that were created for use in labs.
Yeah, and so I wanted to just jump in because Frances said, to clarify, she meant sort of the general public's perception of science. And what I was going to say is, I do think there's this monolithic idea that some people in the general public have, that there is science with a capital S, and it's an umbrella for everything. And I think one thing that's really important for this book and for readers of this book to get is that this isn't a research lab. This isn't the NIH. This isn't the University of Pennsylvania, Department of Biology doing a long study or something. This is corporate capitalized science. These are scientists who are getting their paycheck from a privately owned company that's responsible to its shareholders. And that is a really different kind of science, because that's the kind of science that needs, and that's a kind of research and development, because it's more development than research, really, that needs really strong guardrails around it, because their one concern is not ethics. Their one concern, I mean, within boundaries it is, I'm not saying they're unethical, but their main concern is hitting certain benchmarks to keep shareholders happy, because they are a company, a public company. And I think that's important for this book because, and I think the book lives there, that this is, this is, but I also think it's interesting because until Francis asked that question and I had to sort of think it through, I was like, oh, right, this is a different kind of science. And I think a lot of us assume that science always has some kind of end goal. Like, we always justify the space program. Well, we got Tang from it and computer chips, but not every scientific endeavor needs to result in some economic good.
Yeah,
research is a good in and of itself.
yeah, that's well said. And on top of that, this book goes into the sort of funding. And I can't remember what the term is. It's in the book. I think it's like dual focus or something like that, where a lot of these big idea science initiatives that are turned into products are really funded by the government in a way. Like they'll go to a scientist and say, we will sort of clandestinely fund your cute little rat pet, but we also want that technology right along with it and privately so that we can start training rats to deliver bombs into secret hideouts where they can, rats can squeeze down like this. And so there's this hidden sort of dark side to a lot of these companies that we know and love. They're being funded by the government because they're giving the government these rather horrific abilities. But again, it's muddy, because a lot of them are defense related. There's a part in the book, and then I'll stop jabbering, where they're making another product first called Firefish, which are just sort of glow in the dark, colorful fish, which, by the way, while we were writing, actually became a reality. You can buy them now. And so the sort of hidden part of that technology, I've got this great picture Shäron drew me of it, but the hidden part of that technology was creating a sort of goldfish that could be put into these tanks that would be able to register if there were any like poison agents put into water supplies, because they would glow when certain sort of
I see what you're saying.
chemicals were introduced. And I don't have the picture, but anyway, you get the idea.
Yeah, and so someone just asked something more about writing horror, and I want to get to that in a few minutes, but I wanted to, oh, here we go.
Anyway.
But I wanted to say, they keep on this subject for a minute, because one of the things the experiments revolve around is a term I wasn't familiar with till you were using it. And I think there's different ways to do it. You had said it was biological uplift, which is basically, as I understand it, this thing, and it's used to be largely the province of fiction. And I think now with CRISPR and gene editing technology and things like that, it's becoming more, of a reality of taking some animal, usually, and increasing its intelligence, right? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that leads down a couple of roads, but I was going to say, and I don't know if you agree, disagree, tell me how I'm getting this on, but I can't think of any scenario when that would be ethical, moral, or desirable.
Yeah, it's a unique viewpoint, to put it one way. The main scientist at this Edited Pets in the book is a proponent of biologic uplift. So that's the idea that if we are going to continue to better ourselves, so we, very near in the future, we're editing our genes or the genes of our fetuses or zygotes or whatever, so that they're better built to resist certain diseases. They're more predestined to not have certain congenital conditions. Maybe they're stronger, they're smarter, whatever. The idea is, if we're going to do that to ourselves, do we not owe it to bring the animals along with us? So I'm not saying I'm a proponent of this, but that's the theory behind it. So there's a scientist in the book who's, she believes that we ought to be not leaving the rats and the cats and the dogs behind. They need to be, if we're going to be bettered, we need to better them as well, so that they have a stake and a say in their own fate, So there's
but it's like, I can't imagine the arrogance of someone who would have that point of view, in the sense of it's so nuts. But that leads to this interesting thing I was thinking about, which is, if we want an animal to do like the rats in this book, right? They want to raise their intelligence levels, make them able to communicate with humans. But there's an element to that, a large element, that means you're eradicating the rat's natural perceptions of the world, both psychological and emotional and physical, and replacing them with a more human perception and way of interacting with the world. Which is craziness, because that sort of centers human perceptions in the middle of everything.
Yeah. Now,
But that led me, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say,
Go.
what the CEO of Edited Pets would tell you would be that they're not doing that to all rats. They're doing it to this one strain, and this strain cannot reproduce. It's sort of the Jurassic Park idea, right?
Right.
These
So
are
how well that went.
Well, it's the same thing in this book.
Yeah.
They're created so that they are sterile, they can't reproduce, and the problem is, of course, the prototype is a prototype, and it's not finished. And it has the unfinished prototype has a number of issues that we could talk about, but one of them is that it has not been neutered yet. Like it can still reproduce.
Yeah. Well, and so, but that led me to thinking, a fair chunk of this book deals with, or is told from, the perceptions of a rat. And granted, it's a more intelligent rat, it's an augmented rat, but can you talk a little about writing from a non-human point of view? Because I would just love to know, like, what gear did you have to strap on psychologically to do that?
Yeah, it was difficult. It was it's weird to say it was the hardest part of the book, because there was so much science that I had to understand, and I'm a left brain person, or whatever it is. I can barely do math, and then now I had to suddenly understand what all these genes did and how they interacted with each other and blah blah blah. But really, the only part of the book that I really struggled with and came up against Shäron saying, no, this isn't right, this isn't right, which otherwise never really happened, was getting this rat voice down. Like I envisioned it as being this almost like, I haven't seen the new Planet of the Apes movies, but the original old Planet of the Apes, there's like one that sort of rises up and he's very eloquent.
Yeah.
He leads this sort of revolution. And that's how I pictured it. But really getting back to what was going on with the rat's brain, Shäron was really adamant about it not being even if this rat is watching TED Talks on 5 times speed all day long, which he does in the book, just absorbing intelligence about everything, he would still be essentially very, very young. So he's going to be like emotionally a child with intelligence that's beyond him. So it was a real weird balancing act of never letting it have these 5-page monologues, which was my original inclination, and instead really be operating on almost a hurt child's emotions. Just one who understands a lot about genes and wiring and all these technical things.
Well, and like, what is rats' primary sensory input? Like, is it visual? Is it olfactory? Is it all, like, what is rats, like, what's their main? So, because like dogs, it's olfactory, right? It's like humans, it's visual. So for rats, what is it mostly?
2 years ago, I could have told you like
okay, fair enough.
I couldn't even tell you. I feel like it's more olfactory, but they're really great at almost everything. Like they're extremely, I can't remember the word. They're extremely tactile. They're able to feel their surroundings extremely well. They're really super beings in a way. They can swim for something like 3 days. Like if you threw them in a barrel of water, they can swim for 3 days. They're just really, really tremendous animals who have very few weaknesses. And so that's part of why they're so scary. If this rat does populate with the general rat population, they would
Yeah.
defeat us in a matter of years. We would be no more.
Well, I want to come back to that because I think, you've also written The Living Dead, which was, the extension of the Romero thing. So you've thought a lot about the apocalypse by numbers. You know what I mean? Just like so I want to get back to that, but someone asked a question just to jump into a more writer part of it. Do either of you ever get nightmares after writing the horror scenes in your book, and the way many people have nightmares after watching a horror movie? Or have your own character scenes ever shown up in your dreams and nightmares?
The first part of that question I get asked a lot. The second part I've never been asked. I don't generally get nightmares based on scenes in my book. I more like, once it's written, it's sort of exercise out of me.
Yeah.
I think it's more like, if I know something big and disturbing, and that doesn't mean it's going to be something gory or bloody, but something that's personally to me sort of disturbing, and it's important to the book, is coming up. I think I might think about it quite a bit. And it's feasible that I might dream about it. Like, I know this scene is coming. I'm not really looking forward to it. And that would happen after it's written. No, that never happens. And I don't think I've ever dreamt of my books. I think that's a great. Have you, Grady?
Yeah, well, it's funny. Like, I'm the same as you in terms of what you were just saying, like getting them out of your system. My thing I do is I procrastinate about the writing, and I'm like, why am I not? And I realize, oh, I don't want to be writing this scene. I just don't. And I'm sort of tiptoeing around the edge of the pool. I won't dive in. No, I don't dream about my characters. I don't dream about my books. I still think of my characters a fair amount. There's a couple. There's like 2 of them that I still from time to time. I mean, they're your imaginary friends for like a year.
But they're
so
already sort of dreams, right? Like, it's like
I mean,
about a dream.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't dream about a dream. Although it is weird. From time to time, I'll either have something in a dream that will click into place where I'm like, oh, done. Like, it'll not so much solve a problem, but it'll be an extra thing I need somewhere. Or I will dream I've done this once with a short story, a complete start to finish short story, or a big part of it. Last night, I dreamed a book, start to finish, and I'm like, this is a great book, but it's not my genre. It was a romance, and I just don't do romance. And I was just like, never gonna write that, but man, it was start to finish. It was coherent. It was emotionally and psychologically consistent. Never gonna use it.
My book, Scowler and Bent Heavens, both those books were based on dreams. So
well, like the impetus of it, or did you have the whole book?
Impetus.
Okay.
Like the setup of them. So based on, not the entire plot.
Yeah. Okay, so folks, we answer your questions. Throw them into the Q&A if you want. But we're gonna keep going because now I want to talk Rat-pocalypse. So you've thought a lot, I assume, based on the amount of like into the world scenarios you've written, 2 big ones recently, but about how it all falls apart, right? So what's and I don't want you to give away anything with the book, but in terms of like things breaking down with rats or animals or however you want to do it, is it just a numbers game? Is it at a certain point when there's just X amount of them, they just jam up the works? Or what's that tipping point?
I think in the case of rats, and again, a lot of this came from Shäron, who's obviously very science-minded. For him, I think it was really a numbers game. The rats, if you are harnessing, let's say, just for sake of argument, not that this happens in the book, but harnessing all the rats in New York City, that's that millions and millions and millions of rats.
What, do you have a number? Is there an estimate?
It's easily Googleable. I would have been able to tell you this a year ago, but I don't remember the numbers offhand. There's a lot.
A lot.
And they could, if they were intelligent, they could gum up our works extraordinarily quickly. They could trap us all in the subways. They could flood the canals. They could override our power grid. And they could attack us. They could attack us en masse. And it would be, and they could make it very, very difficult to just move, just to move through space, leaving not a lot of great options. You know, aside from like localized nuclear weapons or something like that, there's not a whole lot of options once that has happened. So yeah, it's a numbers game. It's at that point, it's just a ticking clock. If that one rat reproduces, and this is the tension of the last half of the book, is if that rat reaches sexual maturity, and you know, rats reproduce like every three months.
Horny little rat.
So I used to have this stat too, but I think it's in the book. You know, one rat in 1 year can create, I don't remember, you know, 1,000 rats or something. It's ungodly.
Yeah.
So once that genie's out of the bottle, the reproduction rate just annihilates us. We don't have anything to combat that.
Yeah, and you know, it's funny, like animal attack books used to be huge. I mean, 1974 was James Herbert's The Rats and Jaws. And it was the same year that there was the first animal rights activist going on trial for raiding land. Like, it was the start of the animal rights movement. It was the start of, and it was a huge genre, and it's really fallen out of favor. And I wonder if one of the reasons it's fallen out of favor is because a lot of us suspect in the back of our heads that, like, if animals got their act together and there's no reason they should be tolerating our presence, really, we're done for. We're just outnumbered, you know, like we're just completely outnumbered, and they're better.
Yeah. The last act of the novel is called Swarm Theory. And that's, I think if you're talking about if all the bears in the country banded together, I mean, we can probably handle that. But when you're talking about numbers, rat type of numbers, where in swarm theory, usually you're talking about insects or something like that, where you get enough animals that they almost become a super animal. You know, all these little rats almost in effect become a giant rat that is formless and shapeless and moves almost like water. Once you're dealing with an enemy like that, it's like punching a tidal wave. You know, like you can't hurt it really. Once you get to
that's why I always find zombies such a completely terrifying monster in movies. There's just more of them. There's not, like you said, punching a tidal wave. But one of the most astonishing things about animals to me is we overlap and infest their ecosystems so thoroughly, you know, and yet, except for some minor exceptions, we pretty much live in peace. There are X number of gazillions of rats in New York City, but you very rarely, you see them from time to time, but they're not running around like, you know, they're not swarming McDonald's and taking out all the hamburgers in a raid. Largely, we live in two separate worlds and they ignore us. And so I always wonder if, you know, animals' ability to sort of like deal with our intrusions into their world, we always feel a little like, but if they just change their mind, you know what I mean? We're sort of here at their leisure to some extent.
Yeah, we're sort of like horrible guests that have moved in. What's missing, the worst, what's missing is an organizer, you know, like they're missing somebody who can whip them into an army, who can make them all think the same thought. So that's the only reason why we are, you know, it seems peaceful that we're able to walk through Yellowstone Park and not get eaten by bears all the time. But it's not, it doesn't mean it was peaceful, you know?
Right.
We did shove those animals out. All we see is sort of the piece of it. We're not really looking at the bears that we killed to get there.
Right. Well, and I'm sure, we do that with a lot of parts of America. We don't look at what we killed. It's nice. Oklahoma's beautiful. So I was going to say, someone's asking, are there any animals you think are scarier than rats?
Well, I mean, I wasn't really rat phobic to begin with. I'm not saying I love them. When there's
Yeah.
a there's an alley from my garage to my house where sometimes at night there's rats running back and forth, and I hate it. Um, but they don't like. I don't run screaming when I see them. I think
You're,
uh,
you're not a housewife in a 1930s cartoon.
right. Yeah, there's lots of animals that are scary. I think sharks are a lot scary, and I know I've done a lot of shark research. They're wonderful animals that don't generally don't bother us. Uh, but yeah, I think there's plenty of animals. I'd much rather see a pile of rats than I would a mama bear and a baby bear, or a school
Yeah.
of sharks, or
Well, it's interesting. There seems to be a big animal, little animal conflict
Mm,
going on. We find the smaller creatures scary. Like, I mean,
yeah,
I know
right.
they're not mammals, but snakes, rats, rodents, things like that. But the big animals we think are cute and adorable. To me, I really don't like seeing deer and horses because they outweigh us. Like they can mess you up, like get kicked by a deer, get gored by a deer, or a stag, or kicked by a
Yeah,
horse, man, you're done.
that's true. There is something to smallness that I think is scary to people.
Yeah,
And it's sort of like, if you've got a movie where someone shoots down a bunch of people, like you don't blink. But if somebody gets a paper cut, like
yeah,
it's like excruciating to watch. And I think it's sort of analogous to big and small animals.
yeah, there's
Maybe a
something.
weird analogy. There's something about the understandability of
Yeah, the relatability of it. Like,
yeah,
I'm never going to be in the same room with a bear, but I have been in the same room with a crab, you know?
yeah, yeah. We've
Yeah,
all been in a room that has a rat or a mouse, and
yeah. Well, and I
it,
was going to ask, did you read any animal attack books to sort of to see what other people had done before you wrote this? So you were like, I've got a gut understanding of this.
I think no, I don't think I did specifically for this. I read a lot of stuff about rats, like books
Mm,
about rats behavior, all that kind of stuff, rats in history, pest control, all that kind of anecdotal stuff like that. But I don't believe. I mean, I've read Herbert's Rats, and I've read some other animal attack books, and certainly seen a bunch of movies. But I don't believe I did any
yeah.
specifically. I have a working knowledge of it, though.
Yeah. Well, and someone's asking, they're amending that question to say like, or animals that pose a bigger threat than rats to humanity. But I'm curious, do you think rats pose a threat to humanity in and of
Well,
themselves?
not currently, but like to go back on what I was saying earlier, the U.S. has certain rules about genetic editing that will at least slow down some of these things, but that is not the case in all countries. There are the things happening in this book are happening right now. It's not near future. It's now in other countries where they're doing genetic editing on animals, including rats. Um, so it's coming. Like if that continues, and it will, and that the Jurassic Park scenario happens, and those rats get out, which one of them will, because they're rats, and they reproduce with other rats.
That's what they're
Rats
designed to do.
rats don't tend to stay still. Those rats will spread. So I kind of think Shäron might have chosen well here. I think no animal gets around better than the rat. On ships, I mean, you think about it at sort of the olden days, rats on ships, but they're on every ship today.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like rats might be the biggest threat.
Well, I
Aside from
always,
insects, maybe.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I was also going to say, it's funny. I was talking to someone about this, and we're like, why do you think they had that freaking cat on the Nostromo? It had rats in Alien.
Mm,
It clearly had rats. Like a ship that big, even in space, even in the future, rats are going to be on it. They get up in everything.
yep. Anything I would be really curious to hear if the International Space Station has ever had an infestation of
A rat.
a rat, spiders, something.
Yeah. I would imagine they must have, but then again, they take so many precautions. I don't know. Yeah. So that leads me to wonder though. So did you ever come across in your research a specific Like, because I think it's the Department of Defense that are sort of behind some of this research in the book. Have they ever, to your knowledge, done this kind of animal research, trying to weaponize rats?
Absolutely. Not rat. I don't know.
Not rats.
I don't know that we've known about rats specifically, but there certainly have been suicide dogs trained. There
Like
have,
with bombs, to carry bombs?
Yep. There have been suicide dogs.
How'd that work out?
I don't think we are supposed to know, really.
Yeah, fair enough.
Probably well.
Well, was that thing just a rumor that there were suicide bomber dolphins being trained at some point?
That's real. That happened.
Wow.
So yeah, this is, these sort of DARPA initiatives, or we don't really know, because these are groups that sort of exist and don't. Same time, but yeah, they are constantly studying all this. So they're constantly studying how animals can be used for national defense. And I'm sure they're looking at rats. I'm sure they're looking at insects. There's swarm theory is a great way to look. If you've got, an enemy hiding out in a cave somewhere and you can't get to it, but you have somehow nanobot, I don't know, bees or something that can get through these tiny cracks. And what they're doing with the rats in the book Wrath is they're training them on blueprints so that they know how to get into a facility and deliver some sort of destruction.
So just to ask a writer nerd question, when you were doing this book, because you had a collaborator on it, were you guys working from an outline? Were you going back and forth with an outline, or were you writing actual chapters and moving forward that way?
So it started
like, what was the workflow here? Yeah.
Right. I've done several collaborations now. They've all been radically different. This one was more or less, Shäron had the major plot beats worked out in a really clever, intelligent way. And then together we sort of massaged it so it kind of shaped more like a book. And then I would essentially write the chapters, but with continual daily input from Shäron, and he'd always stay one step ahead of me. Like, we knew the next chapter was the chapter where we're gonna talk about the algae that is light sensitive that they put into the gene so they can grow the brain with red light. And so he would, right before I got time for me to get that chapter, he would send me documents and research on that particular thing. And sometimes he would even write, a bit of prose here and there. But it was always like almost every chapter I would have to learn stuff. So he would like sort of teach me what it was. And then of course there'd be passes on the book. So once the book was finished, then he would kind of do a pass on it, make sure everything flowed, make sure all the science was right, et cetera, et cetera. So while I am responsible for like most of the prose, I suppose, it really was a very close, multiple times a day, back and forth, because there was so much that we both had to understand about each other's contributions.
Well, and I'm curious, like, that's wild to me that, so you were writing a chapter and then he'd read that chapter and like y'all would go back and forth on it?
Yeah, kind of, but
wow,
most of that,
but
most of that was probably, unless I got stuck on something and truly didn't understand how this genetic science worked, which of course happened. Usually we would just kind of keep moving. We'd deal with the details later, but he would always know what problems were coming up, what things I wouldn't understand, which was most of it. And then he would have to essentially find an interesting way to teach me. And so he would send me just photos and grids and, just information that would, and lots of phone calls, just talking me through it.
Yeah. And how long did the process go on? Like, how long did it take y'all to get the book done?
It went really fast. Despite all of this, it was all I was doing at the time. And, generally I'm working on multiple projects at once, but for this period, I had a gap. So it all came together in a perfect space. And so I think we knocked out the first draft of a pretty complicated book in 3 months, maybe. Like
Wow, that's pretty intense.
it was intense. It was very fast moving. It was like being in, a 3-month college class for me, just like learning and immediately turning it into writing.
Yeah. That's really, I mean, I'm impressed. 3 months is insane for a book this dense. And also for a book, so other people can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was a real Michael Crichton air to this. That's sort of like, this is science, but it's a science thriller. I mean, I think it's a horror novel, but I don't see a ton of those now. I see a lot of hard science fiction out there,
Sure.
but I don't see a lot of contemporary science thrillers. I'm curious, like, why do you think this is a genre that's sort of, you would imagine with like everyone being so tech focused these days, this would be the most popular genre out there, because we all are doom oriented. We want to, we all think the world's ending for a number of reasons, and we're all up to our ears in tech. But there's not a lot of science thrillers. Why do you think that sort of disappeared some?
Yeah, you're right. We sort of have moved into something more like Black Mirror, where there's sort of science inspired stories, but there's not. I'm sure that they exist, but there's not a lot of people who have come up to replace Michael Crichton, I don't think. And that was certainly something we were interested in, is bringing back real science to whether it's Crichton or Robin Cook or someone like that, like really dealing with the now or the very near future in a way that I feel like is these days used as more of a jumping off point, in a Black Mirror kind of way, which is awesome, and I love that stuff. But there's room for this sort of somewhat harder, in some senses, work to be done. I think it's just people like Crichton are hard to find, like someone who knows that much about science and is still a good writer. And I mean, it took 2 of us to do it.
I was going to say, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's just from a writer's perspective, there's a huge opening in the market for it.
Yeah.
It was, it's hard though. I mean, I see why it's hard to do.
And then Francis came back to ask about, do you have any writing quirks? Do you need to light it in a candle or whatever? But did that make being a co-author challenging in terms of?
No, I have no writing quirks. My only writing quirk is that I have no quirks. I just treat it like a factory, like I'm working at my own, the Daniel Kraus Incorporated factory. And maybe that's in itself is a quirk. I just wake up early, I sit right here and I work 8 hours, and I do that 6 days a week. I would do it 7 days if I could, but I decided to give a day to the rest of the world, begrudgingly. So yeah, I just work really, really hard because I really, really love it. There's nothing I like better than writing. So it's very easy for me to do that.
All right, unless there's something you have burning that you need to get off your chest, some confession about the sick genetic experiments you're up to in your free time.
Nope.
Or unless someone has a question they just gotta ask.
I will say one thing is that this book, this hardcover book, which is the most beautiful book, which has
it's a great cover,
incredible details that are very good. I really recommend getting the hardcover because it has something special. And I'm not going to ruin much, but on the sort of end pages here, there's all these sort of rats, and they're holding this keyboard, and the keyboard has a certain code, and the code can be used for something in the book. So you're not probably going to get that from, I don't even know if you'll get it in the paperback. You certainly won't get it from the ebook, but there's something special for hardcover owners that the code will unlock something.
Whoa, and those are some hot in papers too. You don't get in papers in a paperback. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, man. I love this book, so it was fun to get to pick your brain about it. Even half the brains involved in
Yes.
writing it.
Probably a little bit less than half.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Grady and Daniel, so much for joining us today. And thank you everyone out there for tuning in. Go get a copy of Wrath here. So I put the link in there. So check that out, definitely. And yeah, and hope to see you at another virtual event like this once again. So once again, thank you, Grady. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much for joining us today. So
Thanks.
bye. Cool.
Take care.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Take care.
Absolutely.
Have a nice night, y'all.
Thanks.